there, welcome to today's book club. My name is Mr. Daryl.
And my name is Mr. Alex.
And today we are going to talk about one of the classic monsters of literature, about a monster gone bad. Alex, what do you think of this fine tale?
I have to say, Daryl, I really liked this one. I felt fully immersed in the book, but not necessarily because it made me feel good. It wasn't necessarily a paradise that we enter with this novel. You feel trapped when you read this novel, but I enjoyed the thrill, that's for sure.
Yes, there's a lot to be said for this book, and we are going to guide you through this today.
Now, I believe the correct place to begin with this is the historical context, and that can inform us a lot about perhaps some of the influences that the writer took from the time in which she lived. Now, let's remember, she is writing during the Regency period. The Regency period refers to Prince Regent, a rather decadent man himself, but it was also a decadent time for the wealthy in general. You had stunning architecture, new types of fashion, and this time spawned many radical and free thinkers.
Yes, it is a time of radical poets, bringing it back to literature, and these radical poets were progressive. They were critiquing society. They were describing society in new ways, which brought about a revolution, not only in literature, but in society as well.
And I think we couldn't talk about these radical thinkers without talking about Mary Shelley's parents, i.e. Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. What might you say about William Godwin?
Well, William Godwin, Mary's father, he was himself a radical, no surprise there, a radical, and he had a lot of progressive ideas for society. He wanted to start a commune in America. He was well engaged with the more progressive ideas of his time.
They were certainly anti-establishment, this couple, and Mary Wollstonecraft had her own thing going on. She wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, quite a transformative book for the time, and this was all about arguing for the equal rights for women, the right to vote, the right to own property the same way a man could. And really, we see the formation of a really wonderful relationship between two like-minded people.
Yes, and what we have is a radical family. We have both parts of the family steeped in progressive values. So what might this bring for our author?
But the nature of this relationship, the rather wonderful nature of this relationship, unfortunately comes to quite a tragic end, and quite quickly in the year 1797, when Mary Shelley herself was born. And she was born, and 10 days later, her mother passed away. In those days, medicine was not quite what it is today, and a lot of women would have died in childbirth. And what's even more tragic is that though Mary didn't have her mother present in her life, she still managed to have this connection with her. In fact, she learned her very own name by tracing the name written in her mother's tombstone.
Imagine that. What a horrific start to begin with. She learns her mother's name by tracing her name in a graveyard on her tombstone.
Quite like the Gothic genre itself.
Yep.
But she got to know her mother in other ways, and by the age of 10, she learnt all of her mother's writings by heart, which I think is a testament to Mary Shelley's literary prowess. And not only that, her parents were involved in very sophisticated literary circles, including the likes of Wordsworth and Coleridge. And Wordsworth and Coleridge would often have these discussions with her father, which Mary herself would engage with. And she was quite an opinionated young lady. And it's no surprise, really, once we know this, that she wrote Frankenstein at the mere age of 19.
Yes, we can see from an early age a very prestigious background in learning and education, and contact with the poets Wordsworth and Coleridge being the first wave of the Romantic era, and then Shelley herself being connected to the main figures of the second wave. Percy Shelley, for example, Byron, and so on.
And this is where Frankenstein really begins. And are you aware of the story of how Frankenstein came to be?
Please tell me.
Well, so the year is 1816, and this year is referred to as the year without summer. And why is it referred to as the year without summer? There was a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Such a large eruption, in fact, that it put tons of ash into the atmosphere, so much so that it blocked out the sun. Now, Mary Shelley and Percy decided to go on a vacation to Byron's summer house, which is located on Lake Geneva. Now, the plan was to spend their time outside in nature to enjoy the weather, but of course there was no sun. So what did they decide to do instead? They decided to tell horror stories around the fire. When an idea occurred to Byron, and he challenged them and he said, "Who here can write the most terrifying story imaginable?" And now Mary Shelley, being the competitive lady that she was, rose to the challenge. All three produced decent stories, but Mary's was really one that was unique in itself. And the legend has it that she awoke from a nightmare during the middle of the day, and that's when she began writing Frankenstein.
What interesting parallels to today. So the friends were cooped up, stuck in a remote location, and couldn't go anywhere. And well, what do we have today, Alex? We have a situation of a global pandemic, and many people are stuck indoors. And this is perhaps a perfect spur to get those imaginative gears going.
Perhaps people should start writing horror stories
Yes.
to take up the time. Why not?
Yeah.
But I think we've also got to speak about the genre here in a bit more detail, and specifically the Gothic genre and how it's different to the preceding Romantic genre. And what we have here is a genre which it's often very reflective of the environment that it depicts. And what a Gothic horror does, it makes you feel trapped within the book. And that's often through the description of the surroundings.
Well, yeah. It can be a spur to the imagination, and the Gothic setting tends to have a claustrophobic feel combined with a remote, isolated, and foreboding location.
Of course. And we can't speak about the genre without moving on to some of the key themes in this book, of which there are many. And the first one I would begin with is the mystery of life and death. Dr. Frankenstein, he has this obsession from a curiosity which then turns into an obsession. And he asks this question: what is the difference between someone who's alive and someone who is dead? And he pursues this idea so much so that he starts getting grave robbers to dig up dead bodies, to collect organs, and that's how he eventually creates Frankenstein. And I suspect there is some historical contextual influence going on here. And I think this has got to do something with Mary's mother. And perhaps the inevitable guilt that Mary feels about being the cause of her mother's death. Although indirectly, her mother dies in giving birth to her. And perhaps this desire to bring the dead back to the living is spurred on by that.
That could explain Victor Frankenstein, the doctor, his motivation for bringing in to life the monster that then takes control of his own destiny.
But of course, bringing the dead back to life has some terrible consequences. And I think this is another key theme that is occurring. And it's something like this. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And what do you think that means?
There is a responsibility with great achievement, with great innovation, which science is often involved with. We have the pressure of innovating and to get new things going and to invent new things and to see new things and to visit new places. The one thing that ignores, however, is the responsibility of knowing what you're doing and knowing the limits of how far you can go. And I think this story is the ideal sort of exploration of what the dangers of science can be, which is to not overstep the bounds and not to push the limits of human knowledge so far that we can't control what we have created.
And I think this is also being spurred on by Mary's acknowledgement of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the developments of new technologies that people didn't fully understand. And we can even see today the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution. You have a planet which is warming, a climate which is changing and potentially leading us towards extinction. So again, it begs the question, are some discoveries worth discovering in the first place? And another thing that comes to mind, of course, is something like the nuclear bomb. We live in a situation today that with one press of a button, the whole world could come to destruction.
Alex, I've got a question. We have Frankenstein as a science fiction tale and Frankenstein as a horror tale. Yeah. Now, there's something to be said for both sides. It is a science fiction in the sense that Dr. Frankenstein is pushing the boundaries of knowledge. However, it is also, as we mentioned with the Gothic setting, it's a horror. It's the unknown taking over and destroying us. What do you feel about that? Do you think it is a science fiction ultimately, or do you think it is a horror?
Well, I don't necessarily think we need to separate the two because, like you quite rightly said, science fiction often has this dystopian element going on. And there's many science fictions that when we watch them, they make us feel incredibly terrified. And that feeling of entrapment, which is so characteristic of the Gothic genre. So I think it's a combination of the two.
I would agree. I personally would push towards the science fiction side because I think that the metaphor of the monster is scientific progress gone too far, and that is, I think, one way to look at it.
You can also see why people call this the modern Prometheus, and you can see the similarities, the resemblances here. Prometheus, who created humankind, he teaches humanity knowledge and he gives them fire.
Yes.
But then he is punished by Zeus. This angers Zeus, and then as a result, Prometheus is. What happens to him? He gets tied to the top of a mountain where his livers are pecked out for all eternity. And I think Mary Shelley here, it's a warning, essentially, to us. That's the fundamental thing I get from this novel. Not to mess with those things that we do not understand.
I would agree, and it is a classic tale precisely for that reason, because it doesn't go out of fashion.
Absolutely. And which moves us on to the next topic, which is the incredible impact of this novel. And, you know, we've seen various Hollywood adaptations, multiple different adaptations. But interestingly enough, people, when they think of Frankenstein, they always associate it with the monster. So perhaps the original version has been slightly lost in translation. But not only this, it's caused multiple and provoked multiple literary criticisms and interpretations. This is very much an interpretable book. And there's one really interesting interpretation of this book, that actually the monster doesn't exist altogether, that this is all a figment of Dr. Frankenstein's imagination, and in fact this monster is a part of his alter ego. And that specific interpretation actually would lead to the creation of the Jekyll and Hyde story.
that's quite interesting. I would say, though, that I would not like that interpretation very much, because I feel the power of the story is in its depiction of a monster that has physical reality and goes wild, kills everyone that Dr. Frankenstein loves. That's where the power of the story comes in, and I think the happy coincidence of this theory you've mentioned, leading to Jekyll and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is an interesting one.
Absolutely. While this is a really dark tale, as is the life of Mary Shelley, who would go on to experience lots of sufferings in her life, including losing Percy Shelley, who drowned, having multiple miscarriages. I believe this novel was a way for her to express this the dark nature of her psychology, and I think it was something necessary for her to do. But to end this on a slightly more positive note, when she passed away, her son decided to bury her alongside her mother and father. So at least we have a nice historical ending where she is reunited with the people who she loved the most.
It appears to have been an extraordinary family, an extraordinary father, an extraordinary mother, and an extraordinary child, going off in different directions, but coming back together in the end, after death.
And also a novel that would go on to have a really significant influence on the next book we're going to be talking about next week, which is Dracula. And we'll be discussing exactly the interesting connection between Frankenstein and Dracula.
Yes, I look forward to it. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for that fine discussion. Look forward to next week, Friday. Oh, there's the bell.
See you next Friday.